Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be embarking on a study of the book of 1 Samuel. Now, this is in consequence to a study that we had been doing on our Wednesday night Bible class at the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown. We had been looking at a chronological study of the books of the Old Testament on Wednesday night. And it's been nearly 5 months since our last study. That was the book of Ruth, and of course before that was Judges, before that was Joshua. We started looking at this as a way to better grasp the history of the Old Testament. And we were about to study 1 Samuel when the restrictions of the pandemic closed in on us and we were unable to meet for Bible class for a while. We had been hoping to resume our Wednesday night Bible classes on August 26th. Today, that I record this, is August 25th, Tuesday. But it looks like Hurricane Laura may put a crimp in those plans. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But at any rate, we're going to begin taking a look at 1 Samuel, the first chapter, and a little bit into the second chapter, which I've titled Hannah's Son and Song, because that's what this section is all about. It's about Hannah's son Samuel and the song of thanksgiving that she gives to God in praise and adoration for his kindness and mercy toward her. But how did we get here? How did we get to 1 Samuel? Let's do a quick review. Now, this is a timeline, and as with most timelines, the dates are approximate. We can't be exactly sure of any of these dates, but these are the dates that are most generally accepted. The Exodus from Egypt occurred in about 1446 BC, and of course was followed by the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness under the leadership of Moses. Well, after that, under the leadership of Joshua, the Israelites entered the Promised Land about 1406, 1405, and began to insinuate themselves in it. They began to conquer the land. And of course, that took some years, at least throughout Joshua's life. And we get to the point where after that, you remember reading at the beginning of the book of Judges, it says that after Joshua and all that generation died, there arose a generation that didn't know the Lord. And then all kinds of terrible havoc and chaos started to break loose, and we know that as the time of the Judges, about 1350 BC to the time of Samuel. It's thought that Samuel was born in about 1105 BC. And of course, the time of the Judges doesn't stop with Samuel's birth, because he himself is referred to as a judge. In fact, the fellow, the priest that was attending to the tabernacle at that time, is himself referred to as a judge, a fellow named Eli, and we'll read about him in just a little bit. But these are the approximate dates that bring us to the book of 1 Samuel. Here's a chart that tells us something about the judges who rose up as deliverers against the oppressors that had been wreaking havoc during the time of the judges in the book of Judges on Israel. And we usually consider Samson as the last judge because he's the one that we read about lastly in the book by that name, in the book of Judges. But Eli, the priest that we're going to be reading about in just a few moments, is himself referred to as a judge, as is Samuel. And not only that, but Samuel's sons, his firstborn Joel and his secondborn Abijah, are also referred to as judges, although Samuel's sons don't seem to be as conscientious about providing godly judgeship as Samuel himself was. We'll read about them when we get to chapter 8 of 1 Samuel. We don't know exactly who wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel were at first one book, the book of Samuel. But maybe because of the size of the scroll that it would have taken to contain such a lengthy writing, it's thought that the story was chopped in half, basically right about in half. So we get 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And it's considered that probably, Samuel is the one who wrote most of the book, at least until his death, and then it was compiled by others. 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 29, tells us that the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in the chronicles of Samuel the seer, in the chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the chronicles of Gad the seer, with all his reign, his power, and the circumstances which came on him, on Israel, on all the kingdoms of the land. And so we see here that Samuel at least began the effort to write the book that contains his name, and then maybe was finished up by the prophets Nathan and Seer. But what is it about? We can divide Samuel's work into three broad categories. First of all, it's about Samuel. And although I've got him divvied up in the first 7 chapters, obviously he doesn't die then. He doesn't die until later on. But the first 7 chapters mostly focus on Samuel, the work that he steps up to do, even as a very young boy. He steps up to do God's work as prophet, as overseer, as judge. Or not as overseer, but as seer, as prophet. Then the focus shifts a little bit to Saul, who was Israel's first king. In chapter 8, they clamor for a king, and God says, give them what they want. And so he's anointed as Israel's first king. Now, although this goes to chapter 14, that's where most of Saul's focus is. Now, he lives longer than that, but after chapter 14, it seems like the focus shifts to his successor, David. And from chapter 15 all the way through the end of 2 Samuel, we find that the focus is decidedly on David. And the book tells us of Israel's transition from theocracy to monarchy. During the time of the judges, Israel was a theocracy. God was its only king. He was her only judge. He was her only authority. But they had no central authority on earth to govern them. And so Judges 21:25, you remember what that says? Every man did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel. Well, they sought for a king. God gave them a king. And the book expresses God's choice for their king, since they clamored for one. And not just a king, but a lasting kingdom. And the story begins with a man named Elkanah and his wives. So let's start reading. 1 Samuel chapter 1. Verse 1 says, Now there was a certain man from Ramathaim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship, and to sacrifice to Yahweh of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to Yahweh there. And when the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but Yahweh had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her, because Yahweh had closed her womb. It happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of Yahweh, that she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah her husband said to her, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat, and why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? We'll stop there. Elkanah tells us was an Ephraimite. Now, that's not the tribe in which he grew up. We're told in 1 Chronicles chapter 6 in verses 22 and following that Elkanah was actually a Levite from the Kohathite line. He's called an Ephraimite because he lived in an area of a rural area, apparently, of Ephraim, Ramathaim Zophim. It's called Ramah later on, which is not to be confused with the Ramah in Benjamin. This was evidently a different Ramah north of the land of Benjamin. Remember that the Levites weren't given their own parcel of land, but they were given different cities, and they were given 4 cities in the parcel that was given to Ephraim. Although Ramathaim Zophim wasn't one, they were apparently allowed to live in other villages as they saw fit, and so he's called an Ephraimite just because he lives in Ephraim. But he's got these 2 wives, and they were rivals with one another. We have Hannah, who was barren, but she's humble. And although her barren condition weighed heavily on her, caused her great grief, the fact that she comes first seems to indicate that perhaps she was Elkanah's first wife. It tells us that he loved her. And it could be that maybe he married another so that there would be children to continue his line, so that the land would stay in the family. Hannah's inability to bear children links her with at least 3 other women in the Bible who played major roles in Israel's history. There was Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, who were also all unable to bear children for a time. However, in each case, God gave them sons, and they played significant roles in history, in Israel's history as well. And Elkanah, like the husbands of those 3 women who we had mentioned before, he certainly wouldn't have been the first to take another woman in order to produce an heir. Abraham did that. We see that in Genesis chapter 16. Jacob did that. We see that with his wives in Genesis chapter 30. But this set up a rivalry, and it did with Sarah and Hagar, Abraham's women, as well as Rachel and Leah, Jacob's women. And it's no different with Elkanah's wives. His other wife, Peninnah, she was fertile apparently. She had sons and daughters. We don't know exactly how many. But she was able to bear children, but she was a mean-spirited woman. The fact that she was able to bear children was the mark of a good wife at that time. Childbearing was, of course, the role that is given to women. And Peninnah wore that proudly, and she constantly harassed Hannah because of it. In fact, you look at verse 6, it says her rival Peninnah would provoke her, Hannah, bitterly to irritate her. And the indication that she did this frequently, she did it repeatedly. I want you to notice something. Peninnah knew Hannah. She knew how to punch her buttons. She knew how to get under her skin. And it's evident that she didn't love Hannah at all. Elkanah, on the other hand, tried to show his love for Hannah, but he was unable to soothe her. He gave her a double portion, and when everybody else was enjoying their feasting after the sacrifice, it must have been an increasingly bitter time for Hannah. And Elkanah did his best to soothe her. And he kind of tells her, "Aren't I better to you than 10 sons?" Now, maybe he was trying to reassure her, but I think maybe it just got Hannah feeling even more discouraged about her situation, which tells us something about Elkanah. He loved her, but he didn't know her as well as maybe he should have. It tells us about their trips to Shiloh, which is an indication of their piety. This is a map of the different tribal allotments in the book of that Joshua tells us was allotted to each different tribe. You see Ephraim there about the center of the map. Here's a bigger picture of Ephraim with Shiloh and what some believe may have been the location of Ramathaim Zophim. Don't know exactly for sure. Some place it a little further west. It's hard to tell. It's not there today. But we can tell by the fact that they are willing to travel at least some 15 miles or so to Shiloh that they wanted to worship the Lord. And this is in line with Elkanah's lineage as a Levite. At least he was willing to show his piety. So they would go there, and although he would give her a double portion after the sacrifices, he was unable to soothe her. And so Hannah voices a prayer during this time. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 9, it says, "Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh." And this is probably not long after he tells her, "Aren't I better to you than 10 sons?" And verse 10 tells us she's greatly distressed. Now verse 9 says that Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of Yahweh. Now this wasn't the temple, but it may have been maybe a more permanent structure than just the tabernacle tent itself was. We don't know for sure. Or it may have just been the tabernacle itself. It says in verse 10 that she was greatly distressed. She prayed to Yahweh and wept bitterly. Now it came about, as she continued praying verse 11. She made a vow and said, "O Yahweh of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to Yahweh all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head." Now it came about, as she continued praying before Yahweh, that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, "How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you." But Hannah replied, "No, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before Yahweh. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation." Then Eli answered and said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him." She said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." And so the woman went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Now, first of all, we can see the intensity in Hannah's emotional prayer. This emotional prayer that included a vow. We can see how greatly distressed she is. In fact, that although she's praying inwardly, her lips are moving, right? She is completely into this prayer. She is, as she says, pouring out my soul in verse 15. I'm pouring out my soul before God, and it consumes her. She is all about this petition to God, which includes a promise to him. She basically says, "If you will give a son to me, I will give him back to you." And she includes what seems to be a dedication of her son as a lifelong Nazirite. For the conditions and situations of a Nazirite vow, you can look in Numbers chapter 6. The difference, though, is that in Numbers chapter 6, it seems to indicate that the Nazirite vow was made by someone who was willing to give himself in this way and to observe the restrictions that this vow would impose on him. What we see with Hannah is that she's promising her son from birth. Much like, remember Samson? He was a Nazirite from birth. His parents made this vow for him. Now, Samson didn't do a very good job of keeping his vow. He violated nearly every one of the restrictions in the Nazirite vow. But we see Hannah, who was willing to offer him back to God if he would simply break her barrenness. And Eli, sitting there nearby, takes notice. Now, verse 3 told us that Eli and his sons were priests. But Eli was also a judge. In fact, if you look with me in chapter 4, 1 Samuel chapter 4, in verse 18, it tells us that he judged Israel 40 years. And we have a generally good impression, at least of the character of Eli. His sons, however, are a different story. We're going to find out later that they were scoundrels. They were terrible. They were wicked and immoral, and apparently Eli didn't have the power to rein them in. We don't have any hard and fast lineage for Eli. In an apocryphal book, Second Esdras, chapter 1, it records his lineage as being from Eleazar, Aaron's son, which of course affords him the right to be priest. But other than that, we don't know exactly what his lineage is. Because he is a priest, he can at the very least assume he's a Levite. And of course, supposing that Hannah is drunk, he initially takes offense. Ironically, though, this spiritual leader of Israel wasn't able to discern the spiritual struggle that Hannah was going through. But in the end, he recognizes her faith, and he invokes a blessing for her when he realizes the piety of this woman. Verse 17, "Go in peace," he says, "and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him." And then suddenly we see some confidence in Hannah. Maybe it was because of the blessing that comes from this man of God. Whatever it was, it says she goes away, and it tells us, New American Standard says, her face was no longer sad. Maybe she believed that God had heard and would eventually answer her prayers. Well, he does. Hannah's prayer is answered, and her son is born. Let's read beginning in verse 19. "Then they arose early in the morning and worshipped before Yahweh, and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and Yahweh remembered her. It came about in due time, after Hannah had conceived, that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of Yahweh. Then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to Yahweh the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him up, that he may appear before Yahweh and stay there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord, or may Yahweh, confirm his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. Now we'll stop there and continue in just a minute. I want you to notice a key phrase that shows up here. We see it there in verse 19. It says that Yahweh remembered her. Now, this is not an indication that somehow God had forgotten all about her and said, oh yeah, Hannah prayed to me. No. What this is an indication that God is about to initiate some kind of activity in keeping with his character, in keeping with his covenant, in fact. In Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1, we find that God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him. And again, it's not that God forgot that they were on the ark. It's that God is about to initiate some activity on their behalf. In Genesis 19, we read that it came about that God remembered Abraham and the covenant he made. In verse 22 of Genesis 30 says, Then God remembered Rachel and opened her womb. And of course, she became the mother of a couple of the tribes of Israel. What this indicates to us is that when it says God remembers, God is about to act. In fact, we see the same kind of thing happening in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 24, where it says that God heard the groanings of the Israelites, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he was about to cut them loose from slavery. The psalmist implies this remembrance of God. He implies that it's a characteristic of his love for us. In Psalm 136 and verse 23, the psalmist speaks of God and says, Who remembers us in our low estate, for his loving kindness is everlasting. God's remembrance of us, his attention to us, is a characteristic of his love for us. And so Samuel is born because God remembered her. And so she names him in a way that is demonstrative of how God had answered her. She names him Samuel. Now, the name, it's thought by most, means heard of or heard by God. And she says, because God has given him to me. Because I have asked him, in verse 20, of Yahweh. So she asked, God remembered, God heard. And then Hannah's son is dedicated. In we left off in verse 23. Let's begin in verse 24. It says, now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of Yahweh in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to Yahweh. For this boy I prayed, and Yahweh has given me my petition which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to Yahweh. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to Yahweh. And he worshipped Yahweh there. Now, there are a couple things that are going on here. One is that the passage again stresses to us Elkanah and his piety. Although he had the right to nullify Hannah's vow, and it might have crossed his mind. Numbers chapter 30 gives men the right to nullify vows that their women make. Although the thought to nullify the vow might have been tempting to him, since this was the firstborn son of the woman he obviously loved more. Instead, he confirmed it, even though it meant that he was going to lose this firstborn son of his most loved wife. Now, there's another phrase that appears to us here. Remember before it said that Yahweh remembered her? Well, here in verse 22, Hannah says that he may appear before Yahweh and stay there forever. This phrase, appear before Yahweh, doesn't just mean, well, to go and serve him. It does, but it's much more than that. It's found elsewhere to refer to coming before God in worship, in service. Only this time, Samuel won't be leaving the presence of God. He won't be coming home. This catchphrase, or this phrase, before Yahweh, is found in other places concerning Samuel in the book of 1 Samuel. In fact, flip over maybe a page or so to 1 Samuel chapter 2. Look with me in verse 18. It says, Now Samuel was ministering before Yahweh as a boy wearing a linen ephod. In verse 21, it says that Yahweh visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew before Yahweh. So before Yahweh, before the Lord, before God, is where we find Samuel constantly throughout his life. The fact that God had blessed her with the son whom she had prayed for leaves Hannah with a profound sense of gratitude and thanks, and so she voices her thanksgiving in what's called Hannah's song. In chapter 2, it says, Then Hannah prayed and said, My heart exults in Yahweh. My horn is exalted in Yahweh. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There was no one holy like Yahweh. Indeed, there was no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more, or rather boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth, for Yahweh is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who are full hire themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7. But she who has many children languishes. Yahweh kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. Yahweh makes poor and rich. He brings low. He also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are Yahweh's, and he set the world on them. He keeps the feet of his godly ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. Those who contend with Yahweh will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. Yahweh will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and will exalt the horn of his anointed. And verse 11 simply says that Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, but the boy ministered to Yahweh before Eli, the priest. Hannah's last recorded words are an exaltation of praise and confidence in God as being the one who hears and helps those who rely on him. In fact, it's one of the longest, if not the longest, prayer uttered by a woman that's recorded for us in scriptures. Another one is Mary, which has a lot of similarities to Hannah's prayer here. We may talk about that more in just a few moments. I want you to consider, though, some of the components of Hannah's song, Hannah's prayer of thanksgiving. First, she recognizes God as the judge and the overseer of humanity. In verses 3 through 5, she says there's no one holy like him, and there's no one whose arrogance can stand before God. And God is the one who helps, who lifts those up who have been brought low. In verse 6, he is the one who brings down and raises up. But I want you to notice something in verse 5 that affects Hannah in a most personal way. She says towards the end of verse 5, even the barren gives birth to 7. The number 7 is a number that indicates completeness. And now, even though this is Hannah's first child, we read that later on she's going to have more. But just by God giving her this one, she feels complete. And then she says that she who has many children languishes. Is that a jab against Peninnah, who had sons and daughters? I don't know. But at the very least, it's a token of utter gratitude for God who lifted her up in her lowest point. And finally, we see that she realizes that God is the source of all strength and empowerment. In verse 9, she says, he keeps the feet of his godly ones. And although in verse 10, those who contend with Yahweh will be shattered, she gives us what may be a prediction of the coming Messiah. She says, he will give strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. Now, before I made reference to Mary's prayer in Luke 1 and verses 46 and following, which closely mirrors, now there are some differences, but there are a lot of similarities with Hannah's prayer here. Both prayers indicate the wonder of God at the mercy he shows to a humble Israelite woman. And also, it may suggest that women in Mary's time considered Hannah's prayer an appropriate response to answered petitions to God, as well as perhaps prophetic of the Messiah. Mary had come to slowly recognize that this child was not going to be like any other child in the world. The child that Mary carried would be the Son of God himself. And who knows if maybe in Hannah's song of thanksgiving, she doesn't also recognize that there's something special about her son who would go on to do great things, maybe even anoint a king from whose loins eventually would spring the Messiah of Israel and the Savior of the world. Hannah leaves a legacy, not just as a good woman, but of a godly woman, a praying woman, a faithful woman. And we can see in Hannah a lot of things that would certainly induce women today who want to be godly to follow her example. Now, it would have been easy not to tell anybody about the vow that she had made to God. Once she found out that she was with child, it might have been tempting for her to say, I'm going to keep this kid. I don't know if I'm going to get another one. But she didn't keep Samuel for herself. Instead, she made a promise to God. You give him to me, I'll give him back to you. And she fulfilled her vow in faith because she recognized that God was the giver of this blessing. Secondly, we realize that her son, Samuel, came from a godly family that was faithful in their service to God. And every indication that we're going to read about is that Samuel, even as a boy, knew that he had been promised to God. And we don't find any complaints from him about this. Don't forget, he's separated from his family and left in the care of an elderly priest and groomed for a lifetime of service to God. But we find that, if anything, he assumes his responsibility in earnest. And I can only assume that although he was a very young boy, don't know exactly how young he was when his mother finally presented him to Eli, that he learned this piety and a reverence towards God, this sense of responsibility to God at home. And of course, maybe an indication is that he learned it from his mother, Hannah. Hannah's story is a wonderful story. The story of her son and her song is a great introduction to the life of a godly man that we're going to read has a pivotal role in Israel's history and thus of significance to all that comes after. Well, thanks for joining us, and hope we'll see you again. God bless you.